Does truth exist?
Because you have faith, does that make this book true?
Does God exist?
So when someone says there is no truth, if you apply the claim to itself, what should you say? Is that true? They don't think Christianity's true. They're talked out of it. You know why they're talked out of it? Because they've never been talked into it.
Cross-examining skeptical and atheistic views. Welcome to Cross-Examine with Dr. Frank Turek.
Welcome to Cross-Examine with Frank Turek. If you're low on the FM dial, go no further. I know you're looking for NPR, but we're actually going to tell you the truth here. And if you've heard that evolution, particularly the theory of macroevolution, is a case that is impregnable, you need to think again, because Darwin had a very big doubt about his theory. And I'd like to talk about that doubt today. I'm going to bring in somebody who just wrote a book on it. And the name of the book is called Darwin's Doubt. My guest today is Dr. Stephen C. Meyer. Steve's been on the program before with his previous work called Signature in the Cell. But we're going to talk about Darwin's Doubt today. Now, Steve has his Ph.D. from the University of Cambridge in the philosophy of science. For those of us in America, we might not be familiar with Cambridge. We think it's like a small community college somewhere overseas, but it's not. Steve, tell our listeners here in America kind of the big picture of Cambridge, and why is Cambridge sort of like the Harvard of England, if you will?
Well, I think they think of it as they think of Harvard as the Cambridge of America.
That's right.
In fact, Harvard was started by John Harvard, who was a graduate of one of the Cambridge colleges, and in any case, Harvard and Oxford and Cambridge are the oldest British universities, and they go back to, I think, the 13th century. So they have an august tradition. Oxford is more well known for literary, humanities, and Cambridge a bit more well known for the sciences. And
so
for my purposes, Cambridge was a wonderful place to study because they had this great program in the history and philosophy of science. But Cambridge is also the place where most of the major discoveries in the molecular biological revolution were made, starting with Watson and Crick and their work on DNA in 1953. So all of the labs that were started around that work are still in operation, and the history of those discoveries is very, very accessible in that place because that's where it was made.
So you are a graduate of maybe the top university in the world, and you have a degree in the philosophy of science, and you've been now working at the Discovery Institute for several years. And when you put out a book, Steve, there is an amazing amount of controversy in the scientific world. Why is that?
Well, the issue of biological origins is a hot button. And it's a hot button because it is a scientific issue. Darwinian evolution, I think, is a scientific theory. I also think that the theory of intelligent design, which we have been developing, is a scientific theory. In fact, the two theories are addressing the same issue: is the appearance of design that all biologists recognize, that Darwin recognized and was attempting to explain. Is that appearance real, or is it an illusion? Is it just an appearance? Richard Dawkins says the biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. And for him, as an adequate advocate of modern neo-Darwinism, the crucial word there is appearance. Well, however you end up answering that question, and especially if you're supporting your answer with scientific evidence, that's going to be controversial, and it's going to be controversial scientifically, but also it's going to be philosophically controversial because both theories have larger worldview implications. And the reason for that is that every worldview has to answer a basic question, what has sometimes been called the prime reality question. What is the thing or the entity or the process from which everything else came? And intelligent design affirms that there was a mind that was primary. The theory of Darwinian evolution suggests that it was an undirected material process. And for that reason, Darwinism, as well as intelligent design, has larger metaphysical and worldview implications. Typically, Darwinism has been seen as a strong supporting plank in a worldview known as scientific materialism or scientific naturalism. And so that makes it controversial.
It is controversial, and I noticed that when your recent book came out, which just came out a couple weeks ago, called Darwin's Doubt, there were a number of one-star reviews the very first day the book came out. This book is nearly 500 pages. Nobody could have read it in that period of time, yet they're putting those kinds of reviews up there. Now, since then, there's been several 5-star reviews from people who've actually read the book. So the vitriol on this topic is just legendary, and it continues because, as you just mentioned, Steve, there are bigger implications here about worldview, and that gets ultimately to the issue of morality and accountability, which we won't go to today, but I think there's political implications here. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes, but today I want to try and stick to the science of it, because this book that you've put together called Darwin's Doubt is really blowing the lid off a big gap in the Darwinian theory. So let me just ask you the first question. What was Darwin's doubt?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. Darwin's doubt concerned an event in the history of life known as the Cambrian explosion, known now as the Cambrian explosion. And the Cambrian explosion is an event in which the major groups of animals appear abruptly or suddenly in the geological record. They appear in a blink of an eye, geologically speaking. And in the Cambrian period, there are, by the current counts, about 23 of the representatives of the major groups of animals called the phyla, the highest division in the biological classification system of animals. And of those 23 phyla, 20 have no ancestral precursors in the Precambrian rocks, and of the 3 that are present in the Precambrian, they actually just appear earlier, and they also appear suddenly, but just a little earlier than the Cambrian and the late Precambrian. So what you have is a pattern of sudden appearance that contradicts the Darwinian picture of the history of life, in which Darwin anticipated that what we would see in the history of life is a gradual unfolding, a slow, gradual development of the complex forms of animal life from the simple forms of life that went before. So rather than seeing this gradual branching tree that he used to depict the history of life, what paleontologists are actually seeing is something that looks much more like a lawn, or perhaps an orchard of separate trees, where each of the major groups of animals is discontinuously represented in the fossil record from all the other groups. And so Darwin didn't know about all the 23 phyla. He knew about a much smaller group. But what he knew about was enough to give him pause, and he said that it was a valid objection. The Cambrian explosion presented a valid objection to the views here entertained, speaking of his own book and his own argument in The Origin of Species. And what I do in the book, then, is I tell the story of that doubt and how it's grown up to become illustrative of not just a minor anomaly, which is how Darwin viewed it at the time, but rather a major and fundamental problem with all of evolutionary biology. In fact, it illustrates the problem of the origin of form and information, which is a problem that is leading even evolutionary biologists to seek out new theories of evolution.
Now, I'm looking here at page 32 of the book, Steve, and I have the uncorrected proof copy. I don't know if it's the same pagination.
We got to get you one of an actual one. So.
Well, actually, this is quite good. I've marked it up so much that I probably don't want the new one, because then I'd have to remark it up.
Have to transfer your annotations. Huh?
That's right. Well, I'm looking on page 32 where you have this chart. As you just said, there were 3 phyla that came in the Precambrian, then 20 that came in the Cambrian, and then there are 5 afterwards, and then 10 that do not appear in the fossil record. So what we have here, if I'm reading this right, 20 out of the 28 fossilized phyla appear in the Cambrian period with no real fossil precursors, or we might say 23 of 28 that have been fossilized come into existence abruptly without any fossil precursors. Now, when we come back from the break, Steve, I want to ask you, how did Darwinists explain this explosion? Because it is not consistent with this gradual view and all these intermediate links that they say exist. How do they deal with it? My guest today is Dr. Stephen Meyer. His new book you need to get is called Darwin's Doubt, The Explosive Origin of Animal Life and the Case for Intelligent Design. Steve has his PhD from Cambridge, so he's no slouch. He knows what he's talking about. You need to get the book. I'm Frank Turek. Back in 2 minutes. Don't touch that dial. You thought that evolutionary theory was airtight. Well, if you thought that, you thought wrong. There's a number of problems with it. Macroevolutionary theory, undirected macroevolutionary theory, what we might call Darwinism. And we have an expert with us today, Dr. Stephen C. Meyer, who works with the Discovery Institute, PhD from Cambridge University. Newest book, Darwin's Doubt. You need to get it. That's what we're talking about today. Before the break, we were speaking about the fact that 23 of the 28 fossilized phyla appear in a very short period of time. Well, actually 20 do, and there's 3 phyla that appear just before that period, but they appear in the fossil record fully formed without any fossilized precursors, which is not what you would expect if Darwinism were true. Now, Steve, first of all, before we go any further, we're mostly lay people here. We're not biologists, so define what a phyla is. What's a phyla?
Well, the phyla are a phylum is one of the phyla refer to the largest division in biological classification.
Okay.
So you would start with species. 2 different species would have a small number of differences between each other. As you go up the biological classification hierarchy, 2 different orders or classes or phyla, as you move up the hierarchy, the differences between the representatives of the different categories get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so in the case of the phyla, the representatives of the individual phyla are exemplifying different body plans, and a body plan is a unique way of organizing tissues and organs and body parts. So, for example, one of the most dramatic types of organisms, or one of the most exciting things that arises in Cambrian are the arthropods. They have an exoskeleton, and they have compound eyes, and a number of features that exemplify the phylum Arthropoda. You also find chordates. Chordates have an internal skeleton, a notochord, and an example of a chordate would be a fish, and we actually have fish now in the Cambrian. So if you look at an arthropod like a trilobite and a fish, you find all kinds of important differences in the way in which their body parts are organized. And the bigger the differences, the higher up the classification system you'll place those organisms.
I know when we come to human beings, that's much later in the geological record, but where would we put human beings? What phylum
human beings
would they be?
are also part of the phylum Chordata, but then you have to go down class, order, genus and we're going to be differentiated in a whole bunch of different ways from other organisms. Birds are also chordates, fish are chordates, but the differences between birds and fish and humans are going to be defined at a lower taxonomic level.
But at the very least, are we saying that these creatures have a spinal cord? Is that what that
phylum
means?
The larger character is called a notochord, and then a vertebrae is a smaller another differentiation that occurs later.
Okay, so now you've got.
But it's basically an internal skeleton as opposed to an external skeleton, which is, you can see a very big difference in the design logic of an arthropod versus a chordate.
Okay, all right, good. So we've got basically 20 of the 28 fossilized phyla appear in this Cambrian period, according to their dating, 500-something million years ago. It happens very quickly.
About 530 million years. The main pulse of radiation of the explosion, I think, is within about 5 to 6 million years, most within 10 million years, which is not only geologically sudden, but as I show in the book, it's biologically sudden in relation to the time required for the mutation selection mechanism to work. I have a chapter in the book that looks at the waiting times that can be calculated using the mathematical equations of what's called population genetics, a subdiscipline of evolutionary theory which allows biologists to calculate how much change would take place in a given period of time if you know certain factors like the mutation rate and the population size or the generation time. Or conversely, these equations allow you to calculate how long it would take for a certain number of changes to occur. And for some very modest changes at the level of proteins, it turns out that multiple coordinated mutations are required And when you have a situation where multiple coordinated mutations are required, the waiting times just go out the window into big exponential numbers, well beyond the length of the time available in an event like the Cambrian explosion, or even well beyond the time available for life on Earth, depending on the number of changes required. Well, the point is that the Cambrian explosion wouldn't require just 2 or 3 coordinated mutations to alter a protein. It would require probably hundreds of mutations in a coordinated fashion. Actually, it's probably incalculable. And so it's the time of 5 to 10 million years is really, it's a moot point. It's a blink of the eye in relation to the creative power of the mechanism as calculated by the equations of neo-Darwinian theory itself, that is to say, the equations of population genetics. So one of the things I argue in the book is that the neo-Darwinian math, the mathematical expression of neo-Darwinism, allows us to show that the neo-Darwinian mechanism lacks the creative power that's been attributed to it, at least with respect to an event like the Cambrian that occurs so quickly from the standpoint of the biological time scale associated with the activity of mutation and natural selection.
In fact, you say, and we're talking to Stephen Meyer, Dr. Stephen Meyer's book, Darwin's Doubt, and page 251, you say the need for coordinated mutations means that evolutionary biologists cannot just assume that mutations will readily generate new genes and traits, as neo-Darwinists have long presupposed. They just assume this happens. And a little bit later, Steve, I want to talk about the philosophical jiu-jitsu that goes on here, because I've said this several times before. I know you've said it as well, that science doesn't say anything scientists do, and how people interpret the data and what assumptions they make will obviously cause them to come to certain conclusions that may be actually at odds with the data. We're going to get into that later, but I want to go back to this issue of how Darwinists explain the Cambrian explosion. We've established that all of these major phyla just come into existence without fossilized precursors. What do they say? How do they explain that from a Darwinian perspective?
Well, the main attempt to explain the abruptness of the appearance has gone under the heading of the artifact hypothesis. The idea is that the abruptness is an artifact of our incomplete sampling of the fossil record or of the incomplete preservation of those Precambrian forms, which are presumed on a Darwinian view to have actually existed. And the main reason, the most popular and probably compelling or plausible reason for thinking that the fossil record is incomplete has been a version of the artifact hypothesis that stipulates that the missing forms were probably soft-bodied organisms or very small and microscopic, and so that they were either too small or too soft or both to be preserved. Now, an interesting find has occurred in southern China that puts that whole way of thinking to the lie, really, and that is that in the Precambrian layers beneath a huge Cambrian a Cambrian find in which the explosion of animal life is even more fully documented, in these Precambrian layers, Chinese scientists have discovered small microscopic embryo fossils, probably the embryos of sponges. And so what we're looking at is our fossilized remains of soft and small organisms, and yet in those same strata, you don't find any of the ancestral precursors to those 20 or so phyla that first arise in the Cambrian that are lacking Precambrian ancestors. And so it raises an obvious question. If you can preserve an embryo, why can't you preserve a whole animal, especially one of the ancestral forms of the Cambrian animals that would have been presumably much bigger and would have presumably had at least some rudimentary hard parts. And in any case, what it shows is the depositional environment was perfectly capable for preserving those ancestors had they been there. They're not there. It suggests that they weren't there at all, that it's not really a problem of the artifact of incomplete sampling, but the explosion itself was real. And leading authorities like Valentine, James Valentine and Doug Irwin, who've just come out with a new book this spring on the Cambrian explosion, though they would part company with me on the idea of intelligent design, do also argue strenuously that the Cambrian explosion was a real event and not simply something that we missed because we hadn't sampled the record, or that the record missed because it was incapable of sampling the ancestral precursors.
I think it was Darwin who did say, Steve, if I'm not mistaken, that he said, well, why isn't every layer filled with intermediate types or intermediate fossilized remains? And he came to the conclusion, well, that's because we have not investigated the fossil record completely yet, and once we do, we'll be able to do it. Now, you're saying we have investigated it more completely now. You've got this find in China. I think you also pointed out in the book that just by drilling for oil, which is something you did in your past, we found that there aren't intermediate forms. Explain that briefly.
Well, yeah, I mean, this artifact hypothesis has a long history. It started with Darwin. And he proposed that, the history of life was something like a novel in which only a couple chapters were preserved here and there. And he said on that view of things, the problem of the Cambrian can be much diminished. Another scientist called Charles Walcott, who discovered the great Cambrian deposits in Canada at the Burgess Shale, at face value, what he discovered showed that the Cambrian was even more explosive than Darwin thought, because so many new forms of life were discovered to have first come into the record in the Cambrian period, and those forms in turn lacked Precambrian ancestors. But Walcott said, hey, well, maybe we don't have a sudden appearance of fossil of animal life. Maybe we have a sudden deposition. He thought that in the Precambrian era, that these marine invertebrates were evolving offshore in the ancient oceans. Then, as the sea level rose, the animals were suddenly, when they died, they were suddenly deposited and preserved in these marine sediments. So the idea was that once we got a chance to start drilling those marine sediments, we'd find those ancestral forms to the Cambrian animals that were present in the onshore sediments at the Burgess Shale. Well, oil companies started to drill in the 1940s, 50s. They didn't find any such thing, and then later scientists realized that those sediments, marine sediments, aren't older than the Jurassic period. They don't go all the way back to the Cambrian. Jurassic dated about 180 million years ago, Cambrian 530, 540. And the reason for that was that plate tectonics theory was accepted, and we know from plate tectonics that the plates are recycled every so often, so there shouldn't be any marine sediments older than about Jurassic age. So for two reasons, that version of the artifact hypothesis also went by the boards, and so and with the Chinese find in the last 10, 15 years, it's I think pretty much dead.
So the Darwinists have no viable explanation for the Cambrian explosion. So they've given up Darwinism, right? Well, we'll talk to Stephen Meyer about that right after the break. I'm Frank Turek. Steve's new book, Darwin's Doubt, The Explosive Origin of Animal Life and the Case for Intelligent Design. You need to have it. It's a tour de force. It's a game changer, ladies and gentlemen. You want to read it. I'm Frank Turek. Back in just 2 minutes more with Dr. Stephen Meyer. Don't touch that dial. Ladies and gentlemen, 2004, National Geographic. Oh, by the way, Frank Turek with you and Dr. Stephen Meyer. We're talking about Darwinism. Let me go back to National Geographic. 2004, they put out an edition, Was Darwin Wrong? And Dr. Meyer, just before the break, was talking about the problems with the fossil record when it comes to gradualism. It does not appear that things came into existence gradually. They came into existence fully formed all at once, and then they left the fossil record fully formed. They didn't change much. They just went out of existence. Stephen Jay Gould had a great quote on that. But I want to quote from National Geographic because they asked the question back in 2004, was Darwin wrong? Of course, they came to the conclusion no. And Steve, I want to get your reaction to this. This was their characterization of the fossil record. Quote, illuminating but spotty, the fossil record is like a film of evolution from which 999 of every 1,000 frames have been lost on the cutting room floor, unquote. Dr. Meyer?
Well, that's one view, but there's in the book I look at some work by statistical paleontologists who have analyzed the fossil record using some advanced statistical methods, and they're not convinced that the fossil record is incomplete. They think it gives a pretty decent representation of the history of life.
No. I didn't give you the context of the quote. The context of the National Geographic quote is not that the fossil record has not been investigated. It's that it has been investigated, but we just haven't found the fossils we're looking for. And so they're saying 999 of every 1,000 frames have been lost, and it seems to me that if I go to a movie and watch one frame out of every 1,000, I'm not going to have any idea what the plot was or what the movie was about. Yet the Darwinists are trying to say they know what it's about.
Well, okay, I see the point there. The point I make in the book is that we have. Let's go back even historically further, back to Darwin and Agassiz. Agassiz was unimpressed by Darwin's attempt to explain away the missing fossils because he said we have a pretty good representation of all the what are called terminal branches on the tree of life, all the forms of life that exist today, going back into the historical record. But the fossil record isn't. It's not. The problem isn't just that it's incomplete. It's that it's selectively incomplete. The only places where we're missing significant representations of fossil forms is at precisely those points on Darwin's tree that would establish that the tree is the correct picture of the history of life, namely at the nodes, at the connection points, or at those internal branches that would connect the different branches that are present, that represent forms of life present today. So so Agassiz, he was no fool. He was a great scientist, and he thought, Darwin, not only is the fossil record incomplete, but Darwin's explanation of why it's incomplete doesn't actually square with what we see.
So when you look at the fossil record, assuming that it is relatively complete, in other words, it's not like we haven't investigated the fossil record. We get a picture of instantaneous creation, or instantaneous appearance anyway, appearance of creation, and then instantaneous extinction, as Stephen Jay Gould said. That's why he came up with the punctuated equilibrium theory, which you point out in your book.
Exactly, yeah.
So they haven't given up Darwinism, though, Steve. Why haven't they? If the fossil record doesn't line up with what they say it should look like if Darwinism were true, why haven't they given it up?
Well, I think a lot of scientists have given up. A lot of even evolutionary theorists have given up the contemporary form of Darwinism called neo-Darwinism, and you see that because in some cases people are saying we needed a new theory. In other cases, they're just busy developing it. And punctuated equilibrium was another evolutionary theory that was developed. I look at 5 or 6 others in the book, and these I call them. I discuss them in a section of the book called "After Darwin What." And I think there is a growing dissatisfaction with the received neo-Darwinian theory. In fact, I go further than that. I think neo-Darwinism is dead. But what you see people holding on to is the idea that some form of materialistic, undirected evolutionary theory must be true. They're not going to give that up because many scientists are committed to the idea that they must explain everything within a materialistic framework. And that's the philosophical issue that you alluded to before, and the rule of science that many scientists think they need to accept as normative, which is sometimes called methodological naturalism or methodological materialism. And that rule just says that if you're going to be a scientist, if you're going to explain something in a scientific way, you've got to limit yourself to strictly materialistic explanations. And that sounds plausible or like what we've all learned about science, but the problem with that is that there are certain kinds of effects, certain kinds of phenomena that we know from experience are not explained by undirected material processes. And one of the principal things that is not explained by material processes alone is information. If you look at the Rosetta Stone, if you go into the British Museum and you see those inscriptions in 3 different languages, you'd be foolish to say, well, I can't infer that an intelligent agent or a mind played a role in the origin of that information. So I'm going to infer that my best alternative would be wind and erosion or something. And that's in a sense the position that evolutionary biologists have been placed in by accepting methodological materialism as a normative principle of reasoning. They have in a sense missed the obvious explanation for what's the really most dramatic feature of the Cambrian explosion, which is the massive increase in the information of the biological world as those animals come online. Because what we know is that to build a new animal, when those new animal forms come online, they have new organs and structures, new cell types. Each new cell type requires new proteins. New proteins, in turn, require new genetic information. So the Cambrian explosion is not just an explosion of form and structure, it's an explosion of information. And what we know from experience, our uniform and repeated experience, is that information always arises from an intelligent agent from conscious and rational activity, as one information scientist put it. And so to force scientists to limit themselves to materialistic explanation for events like that, I think is contrary to where the evidence is leading. And that's at the end of the day, I think that's unscientific. I think the fundamental commitment of the scientist is to follow the evidence where it leads.
Steve, you make a point on page 391. We're talking to Dr. Stephen Meyer, his new book, Darwin's Doubt, on page 391. And Steve, you say this. This is an aha moment for me when I read it, because the way you put it, I think, is so appropriate. You say neo-Darwinism and the theory of intelligent design are not two different kinds of inquiry, as some critics have asserted. They are two different answers formulated using a similar logic and method of reasoning to the same question. The question is, what caused biological forms and the appearance of design to arise in the history of life? This is a critical point, Steve, because I think so many people don't get this. You are using the same methods that Darwin used to try and figure out how we got here. The exact same methods. You're using a forensic science and historical science to try and reconstruct the past. You're just coming to a different conclusion as to where the evidence points. But your methods are the same. Your assumptions are the same. The only thing you're open to that they're not is that there could be intelligence that did it rather than a mechanistic force.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very well explained, and that's really in a sense, my own intellectual autobiography. My story with this is that I learned about some of the early work on intelligent design in the 1980s from a scientist, Charles Saxon, who I happened to meet at a conference, and I left for grad school intrigued with what he was saying, that there was an intuitive connection between intelligence and information. But I wondered if that could be formulated as a rigorous scientific argument. And ironically, it was my study of Darwin's work and his mentors, in particular the geologist Charles Lyell, that convinced me that it could be formulated as a rigorous scientific argument, because what I learned is that these historical scientists, these early pioneers in historical science, were using a different kind of scientific method, one that's sometimes been called the method of multiple competing hypotheses, or the method of inference to the best explanation. And they had a rule of reasoning which helped to define what a best explanation looked like. The best explanation is one which cites a cause which is known to produce the effect in question, known, that is, from our present experience. So Lyell said that we should be looking for causes now in operation to help us explain events in the remote past. And when I saw that phrase in the subtitle to his book, the light went on for me, because I realized that principle of reasoning applied to the question that interested me, which was the origin of the information needed to build, for example, the first life, or the origin of the information necessary to construct these animal forms that arise so suddenly in the Cambrian. And I asked myself the question, what is the cause now in operation that produces digital code, that produces information more generally? And I realized from my study of the evolutionary models that was exactly the point where the evolutionary mechanisms had difficulty as far as being adequate to generate the effect in question, information. But we do know of a cause which is capable of generating information, and that cause is intelligence. One information scientist said that the creation of information is habitually associated with conscious activity. And habitually associated is almost a description of the principle of reasoning that Lyell and Darwin were advancing. We should be looking for what we know from our uniform and repeated experience about cause and effect. And so I concluded that, number one, that the best explanation of intelligence, of the information explosion in the Cambrian was intelligent design, and number two, that was a perfectly scientific inference that I was using because I was using the very methods that Darwin and Lyell had pioneered.
And in fact, if you say that it's not scientific to infer intelligence, then I guess archaeologists aren't scientists. I guess that crime scene investigators aren't scientists. I guess SETI explorers aren't scientists, to search for extraterrestrial intelligence. You would have to wipe out a number of scientific endeavors to say that we can't infer intelligence as the cause. And
oddly and ironically, you'd have to say that Darwinism isn't science, because you judge whether or not something is scientific typically by the methods that are used, not by the conclusions that are generated.
We see that's an important point because you're using the same methods Darwin used.
Exactly.
And people don't seem to understand that. But you also point out in here, Steve, in the book, and we're talking to Stephen Meyer's book, Darwin's Doubt. You need to get this book because it really blows the lid off one of the biggest holes in the whole theory of macroevolution. You also point out that whether or not something is science isn't really the point. The point really is it true or not?
Exactly.
We can argue.
The whole attempt to classify intelligent design out of existence, as they tried to do in the 2005 Dover court case.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's not science. Therefore what? Therefore, we shouldn't think about what it's claiming. Therefore, it's false. Therefore, that's a semantic issue, whether something's science or philosophy or something else. What we care about is the theory true?
Hang on to the thought, Steve, because when we come back, I'm going to ask you a question about a Darwinist who thinks he has figured out how information could come into existence without intelligence. So let's come back with Dr. Stephen Meyer in just 2 minutes. I'm Frank Turek. Don't touch that dial. Welcome back to Cross-Examined with Frank Turek on the AFR Talk Radio Network. We're talking to the great Stephen C. Meyer, his new book, Darwin's Doubt, The Explosive Origin of Animal Life and the Case for Intelligent Design. Now, Steve, you know, when I read a book, I look at all the reviews online, and I found a review that was a voluminous review of this book by a guy who was writing on Panda's Thumb, which, of course, is an evolutionary website based off of something I think Stephen Jay Gould wrote. And he tried to say in his critique of your book, which I don't think he could have read very much of it because it went up right after the book came out. Anyway, he tried to say that the idea that information must come from intelligence isn't necessarily so, that there are naturalistic ways information could come into existence. Now, you say you've had experience with this guy before. There's a backstory to this gentleman who's writing this critique of the book. Why don't you give us the backstory and then give us the reason why you think only intelligence can create information?
Right. Back in 2004, I published an article that became very controversial. It was it went through peer review in a journal called the Proceedings of the Biological Society of Washington. And the editor who finally approved the article was later, persecuted in the extreme. They took away his office and his access to scientific samples, his keys. They transferred him away from a friendly supervisor and put him under the supervisorship of some hostile people, and there was a disinformation campaign. I mean, it was just ugly, and they finally demoted him. And his name is Richard Sternberg. He has 2 earned PhDs in biology, including one in evolutionary biology. And oddly, though the article that was published was really controversial, the journal itself never published any rebuttal to it. But 3 guys, Nick Matsky and Ellsbury and Gishlick, published a piece on a website called, and it was I can't remember the website. It was one of the skeptics' websites, and it was a long piece. And they claimed in it that there was a mechanism that could explain the origin of information. And I had argued. In the article in 2004 was kind of a road test of this much larger argument that I put together in the book, and so I was talking about the Cambrian explosion there, and talking about the problem with the different mechanisms for generating information that neo-Darwinism had proposed, and these guys cited a paper that they said solves the problem, but upon closer inspection, and in the book, in the chapter 11 of the new book, I give a much more thorough rebuttal of their claims. The paper is saying, look, there's all these mechanisms that generate new genes, but when upon closer inspection, all of the mechanisms that they're citing are actually presupposing vast amounts of genetic information, whole cassettes of information that are sufficient to produce, for example, protein folds. And protein folds are the fundamental unit of innovation in the history of life. And the argument that I make in the book is that the neo-Darwinian mechanism cannot generate protein folds because the probability of finding a new fold, the probability of generating a section of genetic text that would be capable of producing a new protein fold is so astronomically small that that it's always going to be more likely than not that a random search for such a new structure is going to fail, and in fact, vastly more likely than not. Well, they don't actually address that problem, what's called in the probability problem. Instead, this paper just cites mechanisms where you have a section of already existing genetic text combining or recombining with some other section of genetic text. So it'd be kind of like saying, I've generated new information by cutting and pasting one chapter of a book and adding it with another chapter. And sometimes having two chapters from two separate books provides something useful to you, but the text itself already existed. It wasn't something that was found by a random search or a series of random mutations. That you already had meaningful text, you already had functional text in the biological sense, and you just conjoined it with some other block of text and said, "Hey, isn't this neat? Now we've got a new section of text that we can call a gene." So it was a little bit of sleight of hand. It was in each case, each of the mechanisms that Maskey and his colleagues were citing presupposed significant amounts of genetic information. In fact, amounts sufficient to solve the key problem, which is the origin of protein folds.
So the information that they thought a mechanism could produce, they were assuming was already there to begin with. They're assuming
the mechanisms that they were talking about were mechanisms of concatenation or conjoining or fusion. So one is called exon shuffling, another is called gene fusion. One mechanism that gets talked about a lot in the literature is called the de novo origin of information, which is just another way of saying here is a brand new section of genetic text, and we don't know where it came from. But we're going to give it a fancy name and give the illusion of there being some mechanism. So I go into this in some detail in Chapter 11 of my book. Matsky tips his hat towards this in his most recent review and mentions all he really does, though, is he reasserts this same paper from 2003 as a solution to the problem of genetic information and doesn't address the detailed critique I make of precisely that paper as being such a solution. The other thing that's kind of ironic about all of this is that paper, that 2003 paper, was cited in the court trial in Dover in 2005 as a definitive scientific refutation of intelligent design, and therefore one of the reasons that the court could rule that intelligent design isn't science. But the paper begs the important questions. It doesn't solve them.
Steve, they could destroy much of the argumentation for intelligent design if they could find a natural process, a natural mechanism that could produce specified and complex information. And friends, for those of you listening, specified and complex information would be something like take out the garbage mom, an illustration I've given before. If you knock over your alphabet cereal or you come downstairs and you see it spilt over on the table and it spells take out the garbage mom, you don't assume a natural process did that. You assume that mom put that together because it takes intelligence to do that. Or you're walking along the beach and you see John loves Mary. You know that intelligence did that. All your prior experience says intelligence did that. So this answers the God of the gaps objection when they say, oh, you're arguing from a gap in knowledge. No, it's not a gap in knowledge. It's not that we lack a natural explanation for take out the garbage mom or John loves Mary or the information on the spine of a DNA. It's that information is positive, empirically verifiable evidence for an intelligent being. Now, Steve, if they could come up with a natural way of explaining that kind of information, much of your argument would be defeated. Now, I'm frustrated because I just watched 3 of your debates, or 2 of your debates anyway. I watched one you had with Peter Ward. I watched one you had with Peter Atkins. And I think I read one that you had with Michael Ruse. And when you pose the question to them, what's the natural mechanism by which information can be created? Here's what Ward said. Crap. Here's what Atkins said. Nonsense. I can't remember what Ruse said. Why won't they give you a straight answer?
Well, because there is not a natural process that we have observed that produces this effect, the crucial effect in question in the origin of life or the origin of the Cambrian animals. And the principle of reasoning that Darwin advanced is that you should be looking for a cause which is known to be adequate based on our present experience. And there isn't a cause that we see generating specified information or specified complexity. You make the right qualification. And in the book, I describe there's different ideas or different definitions or concepts of information, but the concept that is relevant is the idea of information that performs a function or conveys a communication, and that kind of information with very precisely arranged characters to perform that function is not produced in our experience by any undirected natural process of which we know.
Steve, this is not a war about science. This is a war about philosophy and how to interpret the scientific data. And what causes will be considered possible before we look at the data. By Peter Atkins' own admission, he won't look at anything other than a materialistic cause. I think Peter Ward might say the same thing. Michael Ruse, I don't know. But they are philosophically closing the door on the possibility that intelligence has created, or an intelligent agent has created, something in the natural world. That seems to be...
And once they do so, of course, they will come up with a naturalistic or materialistic answer. Of course. But it doesn't mean that that's the best explanation, not by an objective criterion like causal adequacy. It means that it's the best explanation. Whatever they come up with is the best thing they can think of within the range of available materialistic hypotheses. And I've had some really interesting private correspondence with, in fact, with some of the scientists on the other side of the aisle, if you will, that I respect most. Mm-hmm. And one of them wrote me after Signature in the Cell and said, "Hey, look, I actually agree with you in all matters scientific. Even your critique of RNA World, which was thought to be the most promising naturalistic approach to explaining the origin of life." He said, I think it's a completely inadequate model. But he said, "I'm just committed to finding a naturalistic solution to the problem." Mm-hmm. And in a way, I appreciated his honesty, because a lot of the people that reject what we're doing do so as if we what we're thinking, what we've proposed is just not even something they can get their heads around. But it's so crazy they can't make sense of it. This scientist perfectly well understood why I would be thinking about intelligent design, but that he personally was just committed to a naturalistic assumption. I think most scientists are, or most evolutionary scientists at least are, and though some of them are unaware of the assumptions that they're making.
All right, Steve, we got less than a minute to go. If people want to learn more about you, maybe see some of your debates, get more information, where do they go?
I've got two websites, darwinsdoubt.com with no apostrophe in Darwin's, and then signatureincell.com as well for the first book. DarwinsDoubt.com
and signatureincell.com, and then of course you've got discoveryinstitute.org or
discovery.org, and then the new book is available through all the online distributors, and it's also in Barnes & Noble, which has had an in-store display in 300 of their stores around the country, which is kind of exciting. So,
Steve, as always, it's been great. You're doing fabulous work. Keep it up.
I appreciate the interview. This is really a great conversation.
That's Dr. Stephen Meyer's book, Darwin's Doubt. You need to get it. Trust me, friends, it's a game changer. Get it. I'm Frank Turek. I'll see you next week. God bless.